eerie welcome. The road to Ballygally Castle stretched out like a winding ribbon of darkness, bordered by towering cliffs that plunged into the roaring Atlantic. The moon, veiled by shifting clouds, cast fleeting silver beams over the landscape, turning the jagged rocks into the teeth of a great beast lying in wait. Emily Porter clutched the steering wheel tighter as her car's headlights sliced through the heavy mist rolling inland. Beside her, Alice Morrison was uncharacteristically quiet, her usually sarcastic demeanor dampened by the eerie atmosphere. "Are you sure this is a good idea?" Alice finally asked, her voice breaking the silence. She glanced at the GPS screen on Emily's phone, which displayed their destination, a small pin marking Ballygally Castle. "This place looks like it belongs on a most haunted special." "That's exactly why we're here," Emily replied, her eyes flicking toward her friend with a quick grin. "This story could make my career. A haunted castle with a documented history of ghost sightings? It's perfect." Alice muttered something under her breath, but didn't argue. As a skeptic, she had agreed to come only to support Emily and, as she had phrased it, prove the whole thing was nonsense. Now, with the castle looming closer, even her bravado was starting to crack. When they finally arrived, the castle stood before them like a sentinel from another time, its stone facade weathered by centuries of storms. The turrets reached skyward, clawing at the shifting clouds. The windows were dark, save for a single flickering light near the entrance, casting faint shadows over the cobblestone path. Emily parked the car, and the two women stepped into the frigid air. The sound of the ocean crashing against the cliffs filled the silence, relentless, thunderous heartbeat that seemed to vibrate through the ground itself. As they approached the entrance, the heavy wooden doors creaked open, revealing a figure in the doorway. The innkeeper was an older man, tall and thin, with skin so pale it seemed almost translucent. His sunken eyes regarded them with a strange intensity, and his mouth curled into what might have been a smile, or a grimace. "Welcome to Ballygally Castle," he said in a voice that was both soft and cold, like the wind threading through the castle's many cracks. "I've been expecting you." Alice raised an eyebrow. "Have you now? How very Dracula of you." Emily shot her a warning glance, but the innkeeper didn't react. Instead, he stepped aside, gesturing for them to enter. The air inside was even colder than it had been outside, and it carried the faint, cloying scent of damp stone and something metallic, iron perhaps. "I'll show you to your room," the innkeeper said, leading them up a spiral staircase that seemed to go on forever. The stone steps were uneven, worn smooth in places by centuries of footfalls. Candles lined the walls, their flames flickering as though disturbed by an unseen presence. "What's with the lighting?" Alice muttered, glancing at the candles. "No electricity." "There is," the innkeeper replied without turning. "But the castle prefers the old ways." Alice rolled her eyes, but said nothing further. Emily felt a shiver run down her spine at his words. She opened her mouth to ask what he meant, but decided against it. The air felt oppressive here, as though it might crush any sound she made. When they reached their room, the innkeeper handed them a heavy iron key and pushed the door open. The room was modest but steeped in character. A four-poster bed draped with velvet curtains dominated the space, and an antique wardrobe stood sentinel in the corner. The walls were lined with faded tapestries depicting hunting scenes and battles. A small window overlooked the cliffs, where the sea gleamed like liquid mercury under the moonlight. "Dinner will be served at 8, the innkeeper said, his tone making it clear this was more a command than a suggestion. He hesitated, his pale fingers lingering on the doorknob. "And if you hear anything tonight, best not to investigate." Before either of them could respond, he closed the door, the heavy thud echoing through the room. "Well, that was creepy as hell," Alice said, flopping onto the bed. The mattress groaned under her weight, the sound startlingly loud in the silence. "Did he actually say the castle prefers the old ways? What does that even mean?" Emily set her bag down and crossed to the window, staring out at the dark expanse of sea. The waves crashed against the rocks far below, their rhythm oddly hypnotic. "He's just playing up the whole haunted castle thing," she said, though she didn't quite believe her own words. "It's probably part of the experience." Alice snorted. Well, he's doing a great job. I'm officially freaked out. They spent the next hour unpacking and settling in. Emily set up her laptop on the small writing desk, intending to jot down notes about their arrival. Alice explored the room, inspecting the tapestries and commenting on their faded beauty. Despite the castle's unsettling atmosphere, the room was warm and inviting, at least for now. As the clock struck midnight, Emily was jolted awake by a sound. She wasn't sure what had roused her, but the room was dark, save for a sliver of moonlight spilling through the window. She glanced over at Alice, who was fast asleep, her breathing slow and steady. Then she heard it again, a whisper, faint but unmistakable. It seemed to come from the walls themselves, a susurrus of voices blending together in an unintelligible chorus. She sat up, her heart pounding. Alice, she whispered, shaking her friend's shoulder. Wake up! Alice groaned and rolled over, squinting at her. What? Listen, Emily said, her voice barely audible. The whispers had grown louder, though they still seemed far away, like a conversation happening on the other side of a closed door. Alice sat up, her eyes narrowing. What is that? I don't know, Emily admitted. It started a minute ago. The whispers grew more distinct, and Emily could almost make out words now, snatches of sentences that made no sense. Leave, beware, find the child. Alice swung her legs over the side of the bed and stood, her expression hardening. It's probably some kind of prank, she said, though her voice lacked conviction. I'm going to find out who's messing with us. Before Emily could stop her, Alice crossed the room and yanked open the door. The hallway beyond was empty, the flickering candlelight casting strange shadows on the walls. See, Alice said, her tone tinged with relief. Nothing. A loud thud interrupted her, and they both jumped. It had come from above, a heavy sound like furniture being dragged across a floor. Alice glanced at Emily, and for once, her skepticism faltered. There's no one else staying here, right? Alice asked. Emily shook her head. The innkeeper said it's the off-season. Another thud echoed through the castle, followed by a scraping noise that made Emily's skin crawl. It sounded like nails on stone, and it was coming closer. Close the door, Emily hissed, her voice trembling. Alice complied, slamming it shut and turning the key in the lock. They backed away, staring at the door as the noises grew louder, then abruptly stopped. The silence that followed was worse than the sound. It pressed down on them, suffocating in its intensity. Okay, Alice said, her voice shaky. This is officially not funny anymore. Emily didn't respond. She was staring at the wardrobe in the corner of the room. The door was ajar now, though she was certain it had been closed earlier. From the darkness within, a pair of eyes glinted, eyes that didn't belong to any human. Fainting maiden. The following morning brought little relief from the tension of the previous night. Emily had barely slept, her dreams plagued by disjointed images of shadowy figures and incomprehensible whispers. Alice, on the other hand, seemed determined to brush the experience off as an elaborate joke. Old castles make noises, Alice said over breakfast in the castle's dining room. She poked at her scrambled eggs with her fork. Wind through cracks, creaky wood, rats in the walls. That's all it was. Emily frowned, not entirely convinced. The sounds from the night before hadn't felt random. They had been deliberate, purposeful. Still, she kept her thoughts to herself, focusing instead on her coffee and the view of the mist-shrouded cliffs beyond the dining room windows. The innkeeper shuffled into the room with his usual eerie silence, carrying a tray of fresh bread and butter. He set it down with a slight bow and then lingered, his sunken eyes fixed on Emily. You should explore the village, he said abruptly. His voice was low, almost a whisper, but there was a strange urgency in his tone. Talk to the locals. They'll tell you stories. Before Emily could ask what he meant, he turned and left the room, his steps as soundless as a shadow. Alice raised an eyebrow at Emily. Well, that wasn't ominous at all, she said, her tone dripping with sarcasm. Should we do what Dracula's cousin suggests? Emily nodded. It's a good idea. The locals might know things about the castle's history that aren't in any of the books. After breakfast, They made their way to the nearby village of Ballygally. It was a quaint, windswept place with narrow streets and whitewashed cottages. The air smelled of salt and peat, and the few villagers they encountered greeted them with polite smiles that quickly turned wary when Emily mentioned the castle. It wasn't until they reached the small general store at the edge of the village that someone was willing to talk. The store was run by a woman in her 60s named Mary Donnelly, whose sharp blue eyes suggested she missed little. When Emily asked about Ballygally Castle, Mary's expression grew serious. "Why'd you want to know about that place?" she asked, her brogue thick. She leaned over the counter, her voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "It's no place for the living, you know." Alice rolled her eyes. "Oh, here we go." Mary shot her a sharp look. "You think it's a joke, do you?" "Plenty have thought the same, until they didn't come back." "Come back?" Emily asked, her journal already open, pen poised. "Lady Isabella," Mary said, her voice trembling slightly as she spoke the name. "She's the one who haunts that place. Her husband locked her in the tower, you know, with nothing but a slit of a window and a bed of cold stone. They say she jumped to escape, but her spirit never left. And she's not alone. The castle's full of shadows, restless souls." Alice snorted. "Restless souls? That's just folklore. Every old castle has a ghost story." Mary's expression darkened. "You'll see," she said ominously, "especially after dark. Stay out of the turret. That's where she's strongest." Emily thanked Mary and bought a small guidebook about local legends before they left the store. As they walked back toward the castle, Alice's skepticism gave way to a faint unease. "That woman was intense," Alice admitted, shoving her hands into her jacket pockets. "Do you think she actually believes all that?" "I don't know," Emily said, flipping through the guidebook. "But there are enough stories about Lady Isabella to suggest something happened here." When they returned to the castle, the fog had thickened, swallowing the surrounding cliffs and reducing visibility to mere feet. The turret loomed in the mist like a ghost itself, its narrow windows dark and uninviting. "You're not seriously thinking about going up there, are you?" Alice asked as Emily stared at the tower. Emily shrugged. "It's part of the story." Alice groaned. "Fine, but if I get possessed, you're buying me drinks for the rest of my life." The turret's interior was as chilling as its exterior. The narrow staircase spiraled upward, the walls close and damp. The air grew colder with each step, and by the time they reached the top, Emily could see her breath misting in front of her. The turret room was small, barely large enough to hold the wooden chair and table that stood in the corner. The single slit of a window offered a view of the cliffs below, though the fog obscured much of the landscape. Emily moved toward the table, her eyes catching on the initials carved into its surface, I.S. "Isabella Shaw," Emily murmured, running her fingers over the grooves. Alice stood by the window, peering out at the fog. "This place gives me the creeps," she muttered. "Let's get out of here." But Emily was focused on the table. Something about the carving seemed off, too fresh, as though it hadn't weathered the centuries like the rest of the room. She took out her phone to snap a picture, but as she did, a sudden gust of icy wind swept through the room, extinguishing the candles they'd lit on their way up. Alice gasped, stumbling back from the window. "Did you see that?" "See what?" Emily asked, fumbling to turn on her phone's flashlight. "There was someone out there," Alice said, her voice shaking. "A woman. She was standing on the edge of the cliff." Emily moved to the window and shone her flashlight into the fog, but there was nothing there. The beam of light illuminated only the swirling mist and the faint outline of the rocks below. "There's no one there," Emily said, though her voice wavered. "I saw her," Alice insisted. "She was wearing a dress. She looked wrong." Before Emily could respond, Alice swayed on her feet, her face suddenly pale. She clutched at the wall for support, her breathing shallow. "Alice," Emily said, grabbing her arm. "Are you okay?" I don't feel so good," Alice whispered. Her eyes rolled back, and she collapsed into Emily's arms, her body limp. Panic surged through Emily as she struggled to keep her friend upright. "Alice, wake up," she shouted, her voice echoing through the turret. Alice's eyes fluttered open after a few moments, and she blinked up at Emily in confusion. "What happened?" "You fainted," Emily said, helping her to her feet. "Are you sure you saw someone?" Alice nodded weakly, her face still pale. "I'm not crazy, Emily. She was there, and she was watching us." The word sent a chill through Emily. She glanced back at the window, half expecting to see a figure in the fog. But the mist was empty, silent, oppressively so. "Let's get out of here," Emily said, guiding Alice toward the staircase. Her voice was steadier than she felt. "We'll figure this out later." As they descended the narrow steps, Emily couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. The air seemed heavier, the shadows deeper, and though she tried to convince herself it was just her imagination, she couldn't ignore the faint sound of a woman's laughter trailing after them. Soft, mocking, and impossibly close. Locked room mystery. The unease of the turret encounter lingered as Emily and Alice returned to their room. Alice insisted she was fine, but her pallor and silence told a different story. Emily refrained from pressing her. Instead, she focused on jotting down notes about the day's events. Despite the strangeness they'd experienced, she couldn't deny the thrill of the story taking shape. As the hours passed, the castle settled into an unnatural stillness. The wind outside had died down, leaving only the faintest echo of waves crashing against the cliffs. Emily sat at the writing desk, her pen scratching across the pages of her notebook. Alice had fallen asleep on the bed, her breathing slow and steady. It was during this quiet moment that Emily first heard it. The faintest sound, almost imperceptible, a rhythmic scratching, like claws raking against wood. She froze, her pen hovering above the page, and strained to pinpoint the source. It seemed to come from somewhere nearby, muffled by the thick stone walls. Carefully, she set her notebook aside and got up, her heart pounding. The sound persisted, steady and insistent, growing louder as she approached the far corner of the room. There, she noticed something she hadn't before, a small door, half hidden behind an ornate tapestry. The tapestry depicted a hunting scene, its once vivid colors now faded with age. Pulling the tapestry aside, Emily revealed a heavy oak door with an iron handle. The scratching was louder now, an urgent, insistent noise that sent shivers down her spine. "Alice," she whispered, glancing back toward the bed. Her friend didn't stir. Emily hesitated, torn between waking Alice and investigating the door on her own. Curiosity won out. After all, she reasoned, it was probably just an animal trapped inside, raccoon or a stray cat. She reached for the iron handle, but it didn't budge. The door was locked, and there was no key in sight. Frustrated, she pressed her ear against the wood. The scratching stopped abruptly, replaced by a low, guttural growl. Emily jumped back, her pulse racing. That was no animal. For a moment, she considered waking Alice, but then she shook her head. Alice would just mock her, accuse her of letting the castle get to her. Taking a deep breath, Emily grabbed her phone and switched on its flashlight. She shone the beam around the edges of the door, searching for clues. That's when she noticed it, a faint outline of symbols etched into the wood. They were crude and uneven, as though carved with a knife by an unsteady hand. The patterns were unfamiliar to her, but they gave off a distinctly unsettling energy. She snapped a photo, intending to research them later. "Are you seriously doing this now?" Alice's voice startled Emily, and she spun around to find her friend sitting up in bed, rubbing her eyes. "I didn't mean to wake you," Emily said, lowering the flashlight. "You didn't. What are you doing over there?" Alice asked, her gaze drifting to the door. Her expression darkened. "What is that?" "I don't know," Emily admitted. "It was hidden behind the tapestry. There's something off about it. Listen." She pressed her ear to the door again, but the sounds had stopped. She frowned and stepped back. It was scratching a minute ago, and growling. Alice sighed and got out of bed, her bare feet padding softly across the stone floor. "You're letting this place mess with your head," she said, though her voice lacked conviction. She studied the door for a moment, her brow furrowed. "Wait, this isn't on the floor plan." "What do you mean?" Emily asked. Alice gestured toward the guidebook they'd bought earlier. "The map doesn't mention a room here." It just shows a wall. Emily retrieved the guidebook and flipped to the page, showing the castle's layout. Sure enough, there was no indication of a room in this part of the castle. The hallway beyond their room simply didn't exist. Maybe it's an old storage room or something, Emily suggested, though even as she said it, she didn't believe it. There was something deliberate about the door, something purposeful. Or maybe we've stumbled onto some secret ghost lair, Alice said with a smirk, her sarcasm returning. Let's just leave it alone. Before Emily could respond, the scratching resumed, louder and more frenzied than before. It was joined by a new sound, whispers, faint and disjointed, as though several voices were speaking at once. The words were unintelligible, but the tone was pleading, desperate. Alice took a step back, her smirk vanishing. Okay, that's creepy. Emily nodded, her pulse racing. What do? We tell Dracula downstairs, Alice said. Or better yet, we pack up and get out of here. Emily hesitated. The logical part of her agreed with Alice. This was too much, even for her fascination with haunted places. But another part of her, the part that had driven her to become a journalist, couldn't walk away. There was a story here, and she was determined to uncover it. Let's wait until morning, she said finally. We'll talk to the innkeeper then. Alice looked like she wanted to argue, but a sudden crash from behind the door silenced her. Both women stared at the door, their breaths caught in their throats. Something heavy had fallen inside, followed by the sound of shuffling footsteps. That's it, Alice whispered, grabbing Emily's arm. We're leaving. Emily nodded, and they backed away from the door, their eyes never leaving it. They hurried to the bed and grabbed their shoes and jackets, preparing to leave the room. But just as they reached the door to the hallway, the oak door behind them groaned, its hinges creaking as it shifted slightly ajar. Alice froze, her face pale. Tell me you didn't touch it. I didn't, Emily whispered. Her hand trembled as she held the flashlight, the beam quivering as it pointed toward the cracked door. From the narrow gap, a pale, skeletal hand reached out, its fingers curling against the wood. A guttural moan filled the room, and the door began to open wider. Run! Emily shouted, grabbing Alice's arm. They bolted into the hallway, their footsteps echoing against the stone. Behind them, the moan turned into a howl, and the sound of heavy footsteps followed. They didn't stop until they reached the front entrance of the castle. The door was locked, just as they'd expected, but Emily banged on it anyway, desperate for a way out. The sound of the footsteps grew louder, and Emily turned to see a figure emerging from the darkness. It was humanoid but wrong, its proportions distorted, its movements jerky and unnatural. Its face was hidden in shadow, but its glowing eyes pierced through the darkness. The innkeeper appeared suddenly, stepping out of the shadows with an expression of cold calm. Enough, he said, his voice firm and commanding. The figure stopped, its glowing eyes dimming. Then, as if obeying an unspoken command, it retreated into the darkness. What the hell was that? Alice demanded, her voice shaking. The innkeeper ignored her, his gaze fixed on Emily. You should not have disturbed the locked room, he said quietly. There are things in this castle that are better left undisturbed. What's in there? Emily asked, her voice trembling. The innkeeper didn't answer. Instead, he turned and walked away, leaving them alone in the echoing silence of the hall.